I've got Tracy Newton, who's Head of Reward at Yorkshire Building Society, where she started 6 weeks ago, so please don't ask her any too difficult questions.
Absolutely.
And also Roger Fairhead, who is Director, Group Compensation and Benefits at SAB Miller. So for the format of the session, we wanted it to be less death by PowerPoint, a little bit more interactive. So I'm going to let each speaker set the scene by talking a bit about their own organisation and the challenges that they're facing. And then I'm going to lead a discussion, but I'm really happy for anybody to chip in with questions at any time. You just need to raise your hand. Also, should let people know that this is actually one of the sessions that's being live streamed. So we'll obviously have millions of people around the world tuning in. So that means if you're going to ask any questions, you should be aware that it's not just going to stay in this room. So don't say anything in this room that you don't want to be heard in other places. It's also mentioned that if you're getting involved on Twitter, the hashtag is NAPF Annual. I'm a bit obsessed with Twitter, but it's really rude to tweet and share. So can you please all tweet for me? Also, I'll be taking live questions on an iPad, but unfortunately, I've been locked out of the iPad. So when somebody comes up, when they figured out the passcode, we'll be able to take questions from people who are watching remotely. So first of all, we're going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to give us about 5 minutes background on Yorkshire Building Society.
So if I can get this too. So keeping with the notion of not death by PowerPoint, I have all of one slide for you today. So it's very much about keeping it brief, but I think it's useful to give you a bit of information around Yorkshire Building Society, where we are, what we're at, so you can get a feel around the context within which we are facing into the challenges that much of you guys will be facing today. So Yorkshire Building Society, we've been around a while. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, we celebrated our 150th birthday. And we started in quite humble beginnings in a room in Huddersfield where a number of individuals came together and started thinking about how could they support people with the aspiration of owning their own home. And that's where we started. Over that time, we have grown hugely. The organisation is now, we are the second largest building society in the UK. We're owned by 3.5 million members, and we employ around 4,500 colleagues with over 200 branches across the country. As you can imagine, like any other institution in any other organisation in financial services, we've had a challenging time, but we're one of the few that have probably come out of the financial crisis in a stronger position, and part of that is driven by the type of organisation we are and the type of values that underpin our activity and our mutual status. So as I say, we've grown massively. We have a number of different brands that sit under YBS. We have the Norfolk and Peterborough brand, we have a called Mortgages, we have a brand which is around share plans, we own the Chelsea, Barnsley, so we're actually quite a large organisation. And as a result of that, our growth has grown very much by acquisition rather than organic growth. And as you can imagine, as all these organisations come together, there's some challenges that come with that. And from a pensions perspective, those challenges have been really about the complexity that we now face into as we've amalgamated a number of organisations with different schemes. To put some colour to that, we have DB schemes of final salary nature, of career average nature, we have DC schemes in place with various contribution rates, and we have cash allowances in place as well. So there's a whole host of complexity that we face into within the pension space, which already makes it a challenging area to help people engage and understand. What you'll see on the other side of this the slide is our vision. So our vision as an organisation is that we want to be the most trusted provider of financial services in the UK. And that's about financial security and driving long-term value to our members along with exceptional service. And one of the challenges for us is how do we make sure that we take that vision, the values that underpin it around customers being at the heart, our trust status, personal passion, and how do we extend that from not just a customer experience but also a colleague experience. And very much those values are alive and well in the organisation. It does underpin who we are and what we do. So the challenges that we present in terms of pension, we do have a high level of pension participation, and we've only got around 500 non-members of the pension scheme across the business. But what you probably question is actually the level of engagement that we have. So we have folk that are in schemes that run along, but they're not actually proactively thinking in this space. So particularly in DC schemes, we don't see a lot of changes around contribution rates. We don't see a lot of changes or thoughts around investment strategy. And some of that is around, if you think about our history, we've been very much a paternalistic type organisation. People come to the society, they stay with us for a long time, and there's been a perception, I guess, of we look after them in that space. And whilst we want to retain some of the essence of that, we're trying to move to a more new paternalistic type scenario where it's very much about supportive empowerment, and individuals are making decisions around pensions. And I think that's really pertinent when we start to think about the changes, because those decisions are about to get much more and more complex and much more challenging for individuals to think about, okay, what do I do when I come to retirement, because I'm no longer in this space of it will just roll over and it will be okay, and actually there's different things I can look at. So I guess to kind of set up where YBS are in this space, we're a great organisation, we've gone through a great amount of growth, we've got a lot of complexity within the schemes that we have high participation, but what we recognise is that our colleagues need some support in terms of education full stop around pensions, and as we move into a space where there is a lot more choice around what they do when they join retirement, we really need to think about how we help them understand, work through what those options are, and how we make sure that we position ourselves and our colleagues in terms of our offering to help them make the right decision for them. And I'm sure that there is a challenge that many of us in this room are facing into in terms of how do we bridge that gap and how do we help people take advantage of the new choices that are available to them, whilst also looking to build some of that kind of knowledge gap that was present before this even came along. So that's as much as I'm going to say about YBS. I'm sure we will talk much more about the challenges that we face as we go through the questioning element of the session, and I'll hand over to Roger.
Thanks, Tracy. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roger Fairhead from SAB Miller. I don't know if many people have heard of SAB Miller. Hands up if you've heard of SAB Miller. Yes, and can you keep your hands up if you drank an SAB Miller beer last night? Oh dear, that's depressing. I'll have a word with the sales director, and I'll recalculate the bonuses for the year end. Anyway, what I thought I'd do is just set a little bit of the scene for SAB Miller, at least in the UK. We've got about 70,000 employees worldwide, but only 700 of those are in the UK, mainly around sort of corporate head office, because we're a London-listed company. But I thought I'd just share some of the statistics with you about our pension plan in the UK, because it might flavour some of the conversations later. So we've only got a DC plan. We've only ever had DC. The company really started in the UK in 1999, and it was at the time when not many people were setting up DB plans new. So we've lived with DC, which I have to say is a great joy for me. It reduces complexity no end. We have age-related contributions, which I guess is slightly unusual. You guys may have come across that. So still age-related contributions in a DC environment, and you can see the contribution levels there. We think they're quite generous, so you'll make your own minds up on that. And the idea is to give a very generous match to employees and a high level of overall contributions. Just to sort of show the split of our employees, there's about hopefully nearly 700 dots on that page. I've shown this as a scatter graph for age and pensionable salary because I think it perhaps identifies some of the issues that we're facing at the moment. But what we have is relatively high paid workforce because of the nature of the roles, and that presents a problem particularly around the annual allowance for us, and we're struggling with that at the moment because of the high level of pension contributions and also the high salaries. We have a number of employees that are caught by the £40,000 limit. As you can see there, that really anyone in the far right box there that earns a salary of more than 153,000 aged over 60 is paying or is receiving 26% pension contributions, and that will give them more than £40,000 worth of contributions. There's nobody in that box, but in the next box along, so if you like, those in the age range 53 to 60 who are receiving 24% pension contributions, and some of those are earning more than £167,000 a year, are caught by that. In fact, overall, 4.8% of our employees have an immediate annual allowance problem, and another 5.6% will have an annual allowance problem within the next 3 years. So more than 10% of our workforce will be impacted by the £40,000 limit in the next 3 years. So the question for us is, what do we do with them? Is there something else we should do? Similarly, the lifetime allowance is also causing issues for us, and this whole concept of trying to land at the magical 1.25 million. And actually, when you think back, I've done a sort of a quick calculation there, and I think I've put my, oops, no I haven't, I'm sorry, I've put my brief assumptions on there. Somewhere, oh yes, at the bottom. So assuming that you think the 1.25 million lifetime allowance will remain unchanged, and you're getting an investment return of, say, 7% per annum, and you're looking to retire at age 67, really what this chart is trying to show is that you ought to stop contributing at these points. So if you're age 60 and you've got £778,000 in your pension fund, you ought to stop contributing now. Run that back a bit further, age 40, someone with £200,000 in their pension fund probably ought to stop contributing now if they don't want to go over the 1.25 million. So that is causing a problem, in as much as the fact that we've got a number of other employees who are starting to think, whilst I have capacity to make more pension investments, is that the right thing for me to do? So we're also dealing with employees from that angle as well. So again, causing us to think about other things. We did a survey amongst our employees recently, and we asked them what their financial priorities were. And a number of interesting things came up, which I banded into age brackets because it was the convenient thing to do. I don't know whether I was leading the witness here by asking these particular questions, but see what you think. But actually, pension didn't feature very highly with our youngest employees. So those aged broadly between 20 and 25 were talking about repaying their student loan and buying a car and trying to afford the car insurance for the Lamborghini they're dreaming of, and also saving for a home deposit. So that was their priority. A bit later, they were actually talking about home purchasing, still family costs, but started to talk about saving a pension in that 25 to 35 bracket. Thereafter, saving for retirement became more of an issue for our employees once they hit 35. I'm not saying these are the right answers, by the way. I'm just saying this is what people feel. And moving house, children's education. And then, interestingly, in this last bracket, it's really about trying to fund what amounts to 4 generations, actually. People were talking about their children's education, their grandchildren's education, obviously their own income, and also caring for aged parents. So the income demands are really quite massive in that particular spectrum. But this is what employees want, and I guess it started us to think about, well, is pensions the answer in all circumstances to fulfil these financial priorities? So what alternatives are there out there, or that we have at SAB Miller to pension? Well, we've got pension. We're introducing a SIP, a share incentive plan, a save as you earn plan. We have a corporate ISA, and obviously employees are free to invest their money in non-tax advantaged savings products as well. Interesting, just I've thrown a few numbers on there to sort of indicate what the returns might be, assuming a £100 investment, 40% income tax rate, and 5% return after 5 years, as 5% per annum, sorry, over 5 years. Some very interesting returns there. The other interesting thing is that the share incentive plan is a 5-year plan, as you might be familiar with. It actually produces a better return than pension. because it's tax-free on the way in. It's also entirely tax-free on the way out, not the just the 25% tax-free amount. So is there an opportunity there? Save as you earn has other risks attached to it, but nonetheless produces quite a good tax advantage return. The other thing about these other products, of course, is that they are available more immediately for the majority of employees than those waiting till, I think, age 57 now. We've suddenly pushed it out to, haven't we, from age 55, or it's going out to age 57 soon. So the share incentive plan, as you can see there, within 3 to 5 years you can get that sort of return rather than waiting much longer for a smaller return from a pension. So the question for us is, are there other products out there that we ought to be offering to our employees? I guess when we talk to employees, and we might pick up on this subject a bit later, is actually the one thing that sort of occurred to me is, would employees invest in pension if it wasn't for the employer pension contributions that are attached to that? I mean, it's obviously a pretty smart investment, but mainly because of matching contributions. If that were to change, or indeed if employers were to offer contributions to some of these other plans, would that make them more attractive than pensions? And the reality that we're facing, as I say, in our particular company, is that 10% of employees can't have pension anymore. They are above the annual allowance or the lifetime allowance. And for others, it's clear that it doesn't meet their financial priorities. So what is the future of pension at SAB Miller? I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tracy and Roger, for giving really great oversight of the landscape at your respective companies. I think the first question I want to start with is probably quite an obvious one, given the subject of this session. But if we look back to April this year, and you heard the Chancellor's budget announcements around pensions, what were your original reactions? What did you think? Tracy, do you want to take it first?
I think the first reaction for us, I mean, at that point I was working with a different organisation, but actually quite a similar demographic, which was this notion of we were doing a lot of work to engage individuals in the concept of pension and thinking about retirement in the first instance, and we were learning a lot around how people were not really, whether they were really in that space at all, and the kind of understanding that they had. I think our first reaction was one of, wow, you know, this is quite big, this is quite different. How do we ensure that colleagues understand what these actual options mean for them? How do we help them to decide what is the right decision for them? And also, what is our role as an employer in terms of ensuring they make a responsible decision? And I think it takes you into a place where you start to really, you know, if you're in an organisation where you've had, in the past, there's been a lot of people within DB schemes that have run through a process whereby there is a whole notion of they're being looked after. There's some certainty of where they're going. You're already trying to grapple with getting them into a place where that certainty looks different if you're in some other form of scheme. But there is at least some regularity of what income would look like after that. How do you help people kind of do that further shift around ownership and making some quite key decisions, and making sure that they consider all of the other elements that come into play for them? I think the other piece for us was also, are we ready? How are we set up to enable some of these processes to run through? So I think there was probably a bit of shock. It was unexpected. And there's a real tension between, this is great in terms of giving flexibility, and we really want to help people, and you know, we really want people to have that and make some decisions that are more appropriate for them, balanced with how do we help them make the right decisions. And some of what we were seeing was there was such a mix of knowledge out there. So I think those were probably the kind of things that immediately were flying through minds, which was, wow, big change. Yes, this could be great. What implications does this bring, and what's our role in terms of helping people navigate through that?
Does that sound similar to what you thought, Roger?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it probably caught all of us by surprise to some extent. Certainly, we had just been through quite a thorough fund review at the time, and so a lot of those funds had been focused on buying an annuity in retirement, and of course that might not necessarily be the case. At one level, and it was probably just a superficial level originally, I kind of thought this must be a good thing. It brings more choice. But of course, with more choice comes great responsibility, and I'm not sure that employees, companies, society as a whole is necessarily ready to make those decisions with what we've got available. So I think time will tell as to whether it is a good thing. I guess I'm also conscious of the fact that we ought to be sceptical of anything that is announced by any government with 12 months to a general election. And I think there is an element of populist releases, and we've had some others only this week, of course, that I think we probably ought to treat them with a pinch of salt. Of course, the other thing that occurred to me as well was that with great freedoms on one hand is great restrictions on the other, and it wasn't that long ago when we had A Day in 2006 when we thought, well, this was the pension changes to end all further pension changes, and I don't know how many changes we've had since. We've had restrictions in the annual allowance, as I mentioned earlier. We've had restrictions in the lifetime allowance. So at one hand, we're freeing everything up. At the other end, we're heavily restricting it. So it felt a bit odd.
And I think, I mean, you touched on the fact that we're seeing a lot more in the popular press around this area, and I've seen some interesting research saying that actually employers think this will help their employees become more engaged in saving for retirement. And Tracy, you said that's an issue for you. Do you feel that this might aid engagement?
I think it will. I think we're hearing people talking about it, so that can only be a good thing to some extent. So some of the challenge for us is how do we respond to that quite quickly and capitalise on the opportunity that it brings to us in that space. So I think there is more talk about it. I think what it doesn't kind of really, I think we still have challenges in terms of actually the wants and needs and desires and the capability, the capacity actually for some colleagues to save for retirement, particularly if you're looking at a workforce which isn't in this hugely paid workforce. So things like annual allowances just will never even really come into their frame of thinking because they don't earn in that kind of stratosphere, which a lot of our guys don't. So I think what it's doing is it's driving awareness, it's driving conversation. My question is really that it's really driving action in some ways. And I also, you know, one of my concerns, I guess, in some ways, we've got particularly if you look at some of our workforce, there's almost a delay in terms of people actually getting into the frame of mind around pensions because of all of the other challenges that they have in place around buying your property, student debt, etc., managing that. So we're not seeing rafts of people coming quickly. What we are seeing is the messages around auto-enrolment that say, actually, we've got an auto-enrolment scheme and go into that. And I think there's a bit of apathy in place now where people are getting engaged, they're thinking about pension, but they're not thinking enough. So I think they see things like auto-enrolment might be the problem solver for them, when actually what we need to do is take them further and to really think about you going to auto-enrolment, but that's probably not going to deliver what you need to exist when you get into retirement. So I think there's definitely, the interest can only be good from that perspective in that it's sparking discussion, but I think it's only going so far, and that's when we come back to our notion around education and how do we make sure that colleagues don't think, well, there's this piece over here that's around auto-enrolment, there's this piece here around getting lots of extra cash early potentially, but the two don't necessarily connect in that way. So I think there's more to do in that space, if that makes sense.
And Roger, you mentioned that it's making you think about how you structure your benefits packages and offering perhaps more choice around it. Has it pushed you in that direction, or were you going there anyway?
I think we were probably heading in that direction anyway. But I'd certainly, look, I welcome the freedoms, and I think most employees will. Certainly the simplification of pensions, at least in terms of perception, has to be a good thing for employee engagement. Whether that will be quite enough to engage them, I don't know. Well, actually, the answer is certainly not. It's going to need a lot more. But I think we now have an opportunity to explain pensions in a much more simplistic way, that it is now more like a long-term savings plan, I think, than it has ever been. And that is something that probably more employees will relate to. So from that point of view, look, I welcome it, but again, as Tracy was saying, I don't think we can just take that for granted. The onus is on us as employers even more now to help engage employees in it.
And how will you go about that, either of you, in the education piece?
Well, we do financial seminars, lunchtime financial seminars for employees. I mean, the problem is you advertisers, you probably all do. We've got a pensions seminar this lunchtime. Does anyone want to come along? Actually, I'm amazed there's so many people in the room today. This is the best audience that I think I've ever had, which is great. Thank you. And but actually, the reality is, as we saw when we spoke to our employees at different ages, they're just not even thinking about pension. The answer is they should. We all know that they should. We've gone with auto-enrolment only from April this year was our staging date, and we still had 20% of the employees we auto-enrolled decided to come out. And as you saw from those contribution levels, it's a complete no-brainer from a financial point of view to be in the plans. We all know that, and all of us in the room know that. But some employees just have different financial priorities, they have mental blockages, they have all these sorts of things. I don't think there's any easy way, otherwise we would have all discovered it. And I think we just have to plough on, because it's too important to give up.
I think one of the things that the process that we're trying to go through from a YBS perspective is one of the key things we talk about is we want to be a trusted financial organisation. It's about people, it's about trust. So what we're trying to say is actually, if that's how we communicate to our customers, then we want to do that with our colleagues. So we've taken a slightly different tack in terms of how you would communicate to them in terms of pension, and actually looking at how do we go through that process of employee segmentation, understanding what's important to them and talking to them in that way. If fundamentally we're about ensuring a good financial outcome or a good customer outcome for our customers, why should we be thinking about our colleagues in any other way? So I think from a YBS perspective, it's turning our lens to pensions in that way, and not being in this notion of we give you some literature when you join the organisation and off you go, but actually saying how do we do more to treat our colleague as a customer in that sense and help them make decisions that create the right customer outcome for them.
I'd like to open up to see if anybody's got any questions from the floor. Yeah, gentleman over there. I think there's a roving mic.
HMRC allow employees to make payments of up to £150 for advice in time without it being a benefit in kind. Are either of you considering paying for advice for your employees at retirement in order to get them through this difficult decision?
Yes, interesting question. Shall I go?
Yeah.
Yeah. The answer is yes, we're considering it. We've been considering it for a while, actually. It's welcome that it's not a taxable benefit, because I think that breaks down a barrier to doing it, which wasn't particularly immovable beforehand. We are a relatively new organisation, so we don't have many employees that are in that position yet. I think it's become essential. I'm not sure how we could... I'm a trustee as well, but so if you like, with my trustee hat on rather than my company hat on, I don't know whether as a trustee we could not do that and think that our employees were doing the best that they could. So the answer is yes.
I think from a YBS perspective, we're still going through a process of thinking about what are we going to do. So we haven't put things set in stone, but I think one of the key things that we've been talking about is actually at what point do you start to give people advice? At what point do you start to get them thinking about the decisions they're going to make when they get to retirement? And how do we make sure that actually we are communicating with our colleagues throughout their journey with YBS, so they're thinking much earlier around what's going to be the right decision for me, so what are the decision points we're going to make? So that's certainly part of our thinking when we come to kind of our education process. When we get to the notion of somebody getting prepared for retirement, the conversations that we're having internally is how far do we go actually? You know, 150 quid's worth of financial advice, is that really going to cut it in terms of helping people think about what happens next? Do we look at going to a notion of doing more retirement planning sessions that are bigger and are broader than that help people think about actually what does retirement look like for me? When do I do it? Is it phased? How do I manage that? And including the family in that process. So I think where we're at is absolutely we believe we've got a responsibility and the right thing to do to support people as they come close to retirement, but actually it's how actually do we do something earlier and help them think in an earlier point, which is, you know, what does retirement look like for me? And also help them look at actually where am I now financially, therefore what real options have I got when I come to retirement in any case?
It's a very good point. It reminded me actually when I was with a previous employer, we did some retirement seminars for some of our employees who were coming up for retirement, and a chap came up to me afterwards and said, Roger, that was fantastic, brilliant seminar, thank you very much indeed, it was really great, fantastic. One thing though, I wish you told me this 20 years ago because I could have done something about it then. And of course he was absolutely right. Absolutely. And it's a very good point that you make, Tracy, because it's about having that education and understanding throughout rather than only at the end. So, yeah.
There's a gentleman there. There's a mic, or you can shout if you want.
Yeah.
If I just ask, mentioned about people, I think you mentioned, Roger, people who don't see pensions as a priority, and we all know people who perhaps not senior management, maybe middle management, who come to you who don't want to get a pension and want to ask for other things, whether it's some of the things you said or whether it's often just a salary supplement.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned cash allowances as well, Tracy. Clearly, that may be appropriate for people reaching the lifetime allowance or the annual allowance, but what about people who aren't reaching that? You talk about offering other things. Can we offer them other things without reaching the auto enrollment?
Yeah.
Do you want to be there saying, yes, you can have a 10% transfer instead of joint pension, by the way, you're going to have to opt out? Or is there a regulatory risk to that?
Well, yes, it's a very good question, and we've kind of toyed with this issue because this is something we're actively thinking about at the moment. The answer is yes, of course there are problems there, and we have to be very careful that we're not encouraging people to opt out and it's the right decision for them, and all these kind of issues that go through our minds. At the end of the day, though, I think if people have the right information and they can make an informed, educated decision about it, then we should allow them to do so. And it might be, to get around that particular problem, that we have a minimum contribution level into pensions that they have to make, but the excess, because as you can see our pension contributions are relatively generous, that we can say, okay, well, you have to put that amount into pension, but the rest of it you can take in a different way. So we may have to mix and match with that. The other thing, of course, is it's not a straight mix and match, because there's employers' national insurance relief on pension contributions. There isn't on some of these other vehicles. There's different taxation on the way in and also on the way out on these vehicles. So it's quite a complicated decision for employees to make. But the analogy I would give is that if an employee went to an independent financial advisor and said, I don't know, I've got £100 a month that I can invest, it's very unlikely that the IFA would say, oh, you should stick it all in a pension. Don't look at any of this other stuff, just stick it all into a pension. But actually, as an employee, that is what employers are doing. We say, we give you 10% employer contributions, right? And if an employee comes to us and says, well, can I have the 10% in a different way? I don't want it all in pension, maybe can I have a bit... No, you can't do that. You can only have it into pension. And I think maybe, and I hope that times are changing, because we know that that's not necessarily the best financial outcome or spend of money for the individual employee, and yet as employers we're so stuck in that way of thinking. I think we need to sort of broaden out from there. And here's the interesting thing, right? We've got some of the top pension people in the UK in this room today, okay? We have Yorkshire Building Society, who, as you may know, are the biggest in the UK in terms of employee share plans. And what we need to do is marry those things together, okay? If anyone is up for that, if anyone wants to do that as a project for SAB Miller as a client company, please come and speak to me. If you want to do this afterwards, well, here's my challenge to you. Please do that. We'll do it. We'll even pay for it, okay? I'm not looking for anything free. It's actually about finding a system, a platform that marries those share plans, employee share plans, maybe ISAs as well, and pensions together, so employees can make an informed choice about how they distribute the 10% investment contributions, if you like, rather than pension contributions that an employer might give, then we're definitely up for it. So if you're up for it, so am I. There's my offer for you today.
Do you have anything to add on that, Tracy?
No, I think it's a really interesting point around, actually. We were having a conversation this week around, do we even use the word pension anymore? Do we talk about, actually, this is about long-term saving or long-term financial planning? And that kind of takes you to a point of saying, well, is pension, in its traditional sense, always the right way to go? We haven't had a conversation to say, are we going to take the contribution structure and allow people to do anything with it, do something else with it? We haven't had that discussion as yet. But it's certainly coming to mind around saying, is this always the right thing to do? And one of our values going forward is around choice and around flexibility. Flexibility in a framework is what you hear a lot within YBS. So it may well be that in the future that we choose to do something where people have more choices in that space pertinent to them.
Sorry, can I just clarify something? Cash allowance. So do you only offer cash allowances where people have reached limits then?
Within YBS?
Well,
We have some real historical pension arrangements. So there is a small group of people who have a cash allowance that is paid to them in lieu of pension, which was put in place a number of years ago. So it's a kind of closed group. It's one of our complexities that we need to face into and make a decision around, is that right, wrong or indifferent? So we don't necessarily have cash allowances in place just for high earners. We just have it as part of the complexity that we've inherited as we've bolted lots of organisations together.
Yes, and SAB Miller, we have an unfunded retirement benefit scheme as well for those who are materially over the limit, or cash allowance. We also offer, or will shortly offer, on a separate platform, SAYE and the SIP. So in effect, if someone takes the cash allowance, they've effectively got more money in their pay that they can then, on their pay slip, that they can then put into these other plans. But it's a very indirect route round.
Responsibilities with the individuals locked out then.
Correct, it is. And also the communication at the moment is very different as well. So you come along and say, you know, can you tell me about pension? I go, oh yeah, here's a booklet on pension. And then you say, what about SAY? You go, oh, well, hang on, there's another booklet over here for that. And the two don't marry up, and actually the thing that we are now starting to do is actually say, here's one booklet, it tells you about everything, because actually what you're really interested in is not these separate plans, but actually I've got £100, where should I put it?
Carrying on with that, have you now developed total reward statements that help explain the full package that people are getting? And do you show the pension contribution that they would get had they not opted out?
Yeah, we do, yes. That is shown. So yes, to answer your question, we do that, and we also show the choices that they haven't made to remind them, and also about the additional contributions they can make, because at those, if you remember on that schedule of contributions I showed, at certain ages, if you pay a little bit more, you get a little bit more matching. So we do point that out to employees, yeah.
So Tracy, do you offer total reward statements as well?
We don't as yet. It's part of, we've got to bridge the gap in terms of a number of our practices around communication. Our intention is that will be where we move to, and I would expect that we would certainly be sharing with individuals what the opportunities are around pension, have they missed them.
There's a question, Stephanie.
Stephanie Hall from Pensions World. In light of all the new budget freedom to choose, what does the panel think about at retirement? Do you think all advice support should stop at retirement, or should employers be offering advice post-retirement? Because it seems to me like everybody's talking about being in the workforce, offering advice and support from entry onto at retirement, but nobody's mentioning post-retirement, when I think there could be huge scope for disasters and all sorts of mis-selling and all sorts of other problems. Is post-retirement does it feature in employers' plans?
Well, Stephanie, thank you for that. I guess the issue is it really the employer's responsibility? You know, that's what I'm always challenged with, in as much as the fact that I think, you know, not that long ago, my grandfather's generation, I mean, apart from during the war, my grandfather worked for the same employer. He had one job, okay, throughout his working life. I think my father had, you know, maybe 3 jobs, okay. I've already had 5. So, and I think that is the pattern of the future, that people will be with many different employers throughout that time. So, you know, is it right that it's on the onus of the final employer, if you like, to suddenly have to pick up all this advice and the cost of it at retirement and maybe post-retirement? I agree with your point. I think that there is a necessity to have good understanding, if I can put it that way, rather than education, good understanding throughout the life of a worker, an employee, and beyond. But I would just question whether that responsibility should always fall on the employer, and there ought to be another way around it.
I would absolutely echo that. I think there is something about, you know, as an employee, you make a considered decision to support that understanding, and enabling an employee to make decisions that are right and good for them. But there is a limit to that. And there is a point, and actually you're right around, you know, we've got structures in place which is all around being able to transfer and move pensions around in an easy way to reflect the fact that people have multiple employers within within their career. And there's also something for me, which is as all these things come in, you see that the government do a lot of things around the MAR campaigns and the various other things around generic financial education and understanding. And there's something for me which is actually, does post-retirement, does it come into a space like that where an individual would receive further advice? I think it'd be I think it would be very challenging for an employer to continue that relationship post-retirement on a very practical term, to be honest. And there is that notion around who's really driving this, who's really in control, and who's making the decisions around your financial well-being into retirement. What we're talking about is choice, flexibility, capable individuals making decisions that are right for them. So we need to be really clear where this decision-making lies and where the responsibility lies. And on one hand, we're saying it's around the individual, but then we're saying, well, maybe it should be the employer post-retirement. It doesn't really marry up for me in that sense, in terms of where we're saying this should go.
I'm going to take a question that's come in from the web audience, which is maybe going to the other end of the spectrum. How do you actually go about engaging younger employees in pensions, or if we're going away from pensions, in lifetime savings?
I think it's a really interesting one. I think that's very much about how you engage with a colleague from the point that you start talking to them in terms of coming into the organisation, and it's about how we position the benefits that we have in place, the choices for individuals to make, and getting that understanding happening early on. But I think that, again, it's around, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So there's an element around, I think we have a responsibility, or certainly YBS would say we have a responsibility, or we want to take that responsibility around supporting our colleagues in making good financial decisions. And I think that is very much about gaining that understanding, helping people consider what their longer term aspirations are, and delivering choices that are pertinent to them. And I think it's also about making it real to them as well. So looking at how we communicate what is essentially quite a miles away, so far away kind of subject. So I think there's a piece around how we do it, when we do it, and the type of tools that we utilise. But I do think there is a limit as to how far you can go in some ways, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think interested to know what other people here think too. But I guess my perspective is there's this, part of it is engagement, and maybe part of it is just paternalism. Maybe we just have to force them to do it. And I have to say, that's the great thing about pensions, isn't it? Is that actually you can't take the money out. The problem with many of the other plans, the shorter term plans, is it's a bit tempting. You've got the money and it's just there and it's so easy to now grab hold of. You know, are people really going to make what are the right decisions for them? And it's quite tempting to sort of step in from a very paternalistic point of view and actually simply force these people to do it. To say, you have no choice, you know. It sounds terrible to say, but to say, you know, until you've got to 30, there's no choice. You actually, all your money has to go into a pension scheme. But I don't know, maybe that would produce the better answer. And maybe that would produce the better answer for less spend of money and effort and in terms of education.
There's a very careful line I think we need to manage, which is, you know, as we've talked about, pension isn't necessarily always the right vehicle for individuals to save and for them to manage what they need to do. So I think it's about that moving away from traditional paternalism to almost new paternalism, which is we help, we educate, we give people information, we give them as many options as we can, as it is sensibly available. But we have to be careful not to make the decision for them, because we might not get it right.
Got any questions, comments? One at the front. Right, there's a mic.
I've got a question for Roger. The Lib Dems were talking at their party conference about cutting the lifetime allowance again from 1.25 to $1 million to invest in the NHS. What material impact would that have on your members, Roger?
Well, I guess, you know, the direct impact it would have is obviously it would affect more. I think, you know, the reality is that, you know, if we think it's going to come down, it will probably come down again in the future, or even if it stays where it is, just inflation will mean that becomes, even more biting into a wide range of employees. I mean, if you project that forward, several decades, actually £1 million isn't really going to buy you very much at all in terms of an annuity or a regular income. So it has the immediate effect. I think actually, but perhaps most importantly, it has a secondary effect, and this is about pensions legislation, or my moan about pensions legislation generally, it's the tinkering with it, it's the constant change. I think most of us would be happy. Just say it's £1 million, it's 1.25 million, it's 1.5 million, it's 1.8 million. All these figures that it has been over the last few years, stop messing around. If we want to engage employees in what is a long-term investment, we've got to have long-term rules for what this investment represents. And I think I'm just tired, frustrated, and many other employees are, of the constant tinkering with the pensions legislation. Fix it and just leave it alone, and then we'll review it again in 5 years, 10 years, or whatever else it might be. So that's my bigger moan about it.
Got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions? Any more from the floor? Otherwise, I've got one. One down the front. Got a mic? Thank you.
Hi. With no compulsory employer retirement ages, how is you thinking about rewarding pensions and giving people options, aligning with, at some point you may actually want some of your ageing employees to leave the business in the future?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? At one level, it provides great opportunity for employers, I think. We have quite a big business in South Africa, and there's a compulsory retirement age there of 63, as some of you may be aware. And that actually causes real problems in that employees do focus on that and leave, and we sometimes have a problem retaining employees. With no retirement age, I guess that presents other issues. But the reality is, for most organisations that I've worked in, even though the retirement age has been 65, there's always been very few employees between the ages of 60 and 65, and not necessarily because of their own choice. And therefore, from that point of view, I think this is one of the other issues, if I can, in a circular way, answer your question, where employees plan their pension savings on the assumption that they will still be working in full employment at their age 65, 67, 70, whatever age they want to go up to. The reality is probably they won't. If we look at what's happening in organisations, they don't necessarily have the choice to go through to that. Things will change, restructuring, it's not age discriminatory, but businesses change, employees move on, it's more difficult to find a job as you get older, it's difficult to find a job at the same income level as you get older too, that I think that does impact retirement planning. Certainly, and with my employer's hat on, I welcome that, because I think it's great that employees who are often the most skilled, the most experienced, and you are much more able to retain that skill and experience of the older generation is very welcome. But there's the dilemma really. We should probably reduce our pension contributions so they have to work on a lot more. It's my employee retention plan.
What do you think, Tracy?
I think it's a really interesting one. I think there is a reality which, and I think it's different in different industries in terms of what the challenge is. I've worked in organisations where we've had skill shortages, and actually the fact that people will work post 60, 65 is welcome, and we would love that. I guess you're right, there is another notion of actually will we have people who will need to work further from an age perspective, and actually that might not be quite right for us as an organisation, and I think that brings with it some trickier conversations and impacts to have. And I think the thing for me would be, and it is back to that forward planning for an individual, is actually having them think about when do they think they would like to retire. If these are individuals who actually don't want to work past 65, don't want to be with us when they're 70, regardless of what we want, there's something around actually helping people see earlier that if that is the place, if that is the point that they want to exit, what do they need to do now to make that happen? And I know I seem to bang on about it, but there is something for me, which is what can we do earlier to help people plan in a much more sensible manner so they don't get to a point of feeling like, I have to work, I've got to stay here, I don't want to be here, which is actually not what any employer wants. So I think there's something around that. It is tricky when you get to a point where actually someone's age makes them potentially incapable of working, but they wish to. And I don't think that's a situation that any of us really want to find ourselves in. But I think you're right, it is going to be a reality as we move forward. And will that put more pressure on us around things like managing people through capability and making sure we do it in the right way so it's not age discriminatory, etc. I think that is a reality that a lot of organisations are going to face if the state provision gets less, if people are expected to work longer, if people's health or mental capacity isn't necessarily where we need it to be. I think that's just a reality of what's coming. What I'd rather see us do is be in a position where we can avoid that because people have planned in a better way so they can leave at a point that is appropriate for them and the organisation.
Fantastic. At that point, I think we have just about run out of time. I'd like to thank Roger and Tracy for their fantastic contributions, and I'd like to thank everybody for being really engaged because it's really difficult for a chair when nobody's got any questions. So thank you very much. Been told to tell you, I think you've got a coffee break now until 11:30 and then sessions will start up again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.